Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with a lecture on the lymphatic system for Anatomy and Physiology 2 at Madison Area Technical College. Before we look at the structure and function of the lymphatic system, I'd like to point out the difference between the lymphatic system and the immune system, even though sometimes they're used interchangeably, but incorrectly so. The lymphatic system is an anatomical system composed of specific organs and tissues. Now, it is true that some of these organs and tissues have one function related to the immune system, but they have other functions as well. The immune system, in contrast, is considered a functional system. It's not a specific set of organs and tissues, but rather a set of mechanisms that provide us with protection against infection and disease. In this lecture, we're just looking mainly at the components of the lymphatic system. And of course, we'll discuss the function of each component as we go. So it's often said that there are three main components of the lymphatic system: the vessels, lymphatic vessels, the fluid, also called lymph or lymphatic fluid, and then the organs, specifically the red bone marrow, the thymus, and the lymph nodes. But as you can see, there's some other organs related. And so we're going to do it a little bit differently. We're going to separate the components by the vessels being one organ, lymphatic vessels, carrying a fluid, which is really a tissue called lymph, and then the lymphoid organs broken into two categories: primary organs versus secondary organs. The primary organs are the red bone marrow and the thymus gland. This is where leukocytes are born, white blood cells are born, specifically in the red bone marrow. And some of them mature in other locations, specifically T lymphocytes mature in the thymus gland. They become able to do their job in the thymus gland. The secondary organs are where mature white blood cells, including those T lymphocytes, live, where they're housed, where they reside. And this is where they will first encounter foreign antigens or pathogens. So leukocytes present in the lymph nodes, the spleen, the tonsils, and lymphoid tissues in various organs will first encounter anything foreign that they can guard us against. Some locations of lymphoid tissue we'll discuss in the next lecture, but the intestine, the appendix, and parts of the respiratory system contain lymphoid tissue. So that's the structure. Now let's look at the functions of the lymphatic system. You have a study question that asks you to identify 5 major functions of the lymphatic system. But I generally think of 3 or 4 categories of lymphatic function. So when I talk about them, you might feel like there's just 3 or 4, but I numbered them on this slide so that you could answer that question. So the first function of the lymphatic system is related to balancing fluid between cells in the interstitial spaces and fluid in the bloodstream. So excess interstitial fluid needs to be returned to the bloodstream. And with that, any plasma proteins that escaped the blood at the capillary bed. It needs to travel in lymphatic vessels and taken back to the bloodstream. So that's one thing that the lymphatic system does. Another thing is closely related. It's still the transport of lymphatic fluid, but in this case, or interstitial fluid, in this case, that interstitial fluid has lipids in it because these vessels that perform this function, these lymphatic vessels, are surrounding the intestine. And the intestine has absorbed all sorts of nutrients, including lipids. And those lipids can't directly access the bloodstream. They have to be carried by the lymphatic vessels to a circulatory vessel or a blood vessel. So another function of the lymphatic system is to transport absorbed fat from the intestine to the bloodstream. The third function is formation of leukocytes, and of course that would be performed by the bone marrow as well as the thymus. And then the fourth and fifth functions are related to defense and immune related work, like filtering lymphatic fluid to make sure that antigens and pathogens aren't transmitted throughout the body, or just providing a site for where these immune cells and white blood cells can encounter antigens and pathogens and be activated. So we're first going to look at lymphatic fluid and how it's formed. You already know quite a bit about this. You know that at the capillary beds, some of the plasma escapes at the arterial end, and not all of it is reabsorbed into the venous end of a capillary. So this creates excess interstitial fluid. The lymphatic fluid is this interstitial fluid, but once it enters a lymphatic vessel, we call it lymphatic fluid or lymph. And therefore it's similar to plasma, just a little bit lower in protein though, because many plasma proteins do not escape the blood. They stay in the blood. Water is one of the primary things that escapes the blood, and very, very small molecules. So like interstitial fluid, lymph is generally colorless, but there might be some cells present, like bacteria or cancer cells that have broken off of tumors, maybe viruses. And then, of course, as I mentioned previously, there are vessels surrounding the intestine that will have extra lipid in them. And the vessels surrounding the small intestine at this location are called lacteals because they look milky white. So lacteals are lymphatic vessels that surround the small intestine and transport lipids that have been absorbed back to the bloodstream. Here's a picture of lymphatic vessels that surround the small intestine and look this milky white. Most lymphatic vessels are transparent because the lymph is transparent. So let me describe what you're looking at a little bit. First, this is from the abdomen of a horse, and you can see the intestine, tube-like structures, and some of it has been pulled out so that you can make out the mesentery that connects the entire length of the intestine. And this mesentery is just this connective tissue, kind of keeps it all held together. And within the mesentery are blood vessels. They're dark because they're carrying blood. And the lacteals look yellow or white because of the presence of lipids. Now, flow in lymphatic vessels, or the flow of lymph, is just in one direction. So I kind of have an arrow here that shows you that lymphatic fluid is collected here from the region of the small intestine and will go in just one direction where many vessels will merge together. Eventually, all the lymph from these lacteals will merge into a lymphatic vessel that connects to the circulatory system. Okay, here are two drawings that show the extent of lymphatic vessels and the locations of these vessels in the body. Notice that they tend to follow the same general pathway as blood vessels. At least you can see that in the superior region of the picture on the left. The green vessels are lymphatic vessels, the blue vessels are veins. You can see it a little bit more thoroughly in the picture on the right, where you see the aorta coming down through the abdomen and then splitting off into the iliac vessels. And lymphatic vessels kind of follow that general same pathway. In fact, both blood vessels and lymphatic vessels are usually wrapped together in a loose connective tissue. So they're very widespread, but they are absent in bones and teeth. A recent study in the journal Nature, I think it was 2019, revealed that there are lymphatic vessels at the base of the skull within the meninges surrounding the brain. So these lymphatic vessels that surround the brain will drain cerebral spinal fluid. It's kind of interesting. And this slide just says everything that has written on it, everything that I just said, so that you can answer study question 2-3 that I've given you. Now we're going to look at some more lymphatic vessels and the path of lymph flowing through those vessels. Remember that the flow is only one way. That is, it goes from interstitial fluid to the bloodstream in some kind of lymphatic vessel. So first we have small capillaries, and I'm picking a capillary here above the pectoral region, close to the axillary region. That's really small, so this is a lymphatic capillary. And as lymph travels to the left, more capillaries merge together, eventually forming a larger vessel called a collecting vessel, or collecting lymphatic vessel. And then many lymphatic collecting vessels merge together to form a lymphatic trunk. And then lymphatic trunks merge together. There's only 9 lymphatic trunks, which we'll look at in a second. But lymphatic trunks then merge together to form a duct. And there's only 2 ducts. One on the right side of the body, which is labeled over here, and one on the left side. The one on the right side you can see is entering that vein right there. So from a lymphatic capillary to a collecting vessel, to a trunk, to a duct, and then finally the lymph enters the bloodstream. So lymphatic capillaries is where lymph begins as interstitial fluid enters these capillaries. And the capillaries kind of are interwoven with the blood capillaries. And the lymphatic capillaries look similar, but they're much more permeable than the blood capillaries. They're very porous. And that's because there's no tight junctions in between cells that make up the wall of the capillary. Remember, in continuous blood capillaries, there were tight junctions, but in lymphatic capillaries, there aren't. In fact, these lymphatic capillaries are so porous that even cells can fit in between these cells that make up the wall here, like bacterial cells and cancer cells can squeeze in there and enter the lymph. The second feature that makes lymphatic capillaries more permeable than blood capillaries is due to the presence of mini valves. And these mini valves are present between the cells that form the wall. And I've got one circled in red on the diagram, a mini valve. They're located between cells or at cell-cell junctions. And they open when the volume of interstitial fluid increases. So if there's a lot of fluid buildup in between tissue cells, that puts pressure against the outside of the lymphatic capillary, and there's another mechanism involved, but it causes these mini valves to open. So if there's a buildup of lymphatic fluid, so excess lymphatic fluid, which isn't very common because it's going into the bloodstream, but if there were, and it can happen due to blockage and things, that would close the valves. So it's much harder to have, actually almost impossible, to have lymphatic fluid leave a lymphatic vessel and go out to the interstitial space due to the presence of these mini valves that prevent backflow. Let's look at a picture of a mini valve in a little bit higher magnification. Of course, it's just a drawing. We can explain how they open and close based on the fact that there are collagen fibers, shown here in purple and called collagen filaments, that anchor the capillaries to surrounding loose connective tissue. And the fibers or filaments are at the very end of a cell where the valves are located. When interstitial pressure is high, when there's a lot of fluid outside the capillary, these collagen filaments move and pull on the overlapped cell, bringing it outward, and so that opens the valves. But of course, if fluid were to press in this direction, it would have no effect. It wouldn't pull the valves open. I mean, some fluid might squeeze through, of course. There's no tight junctions. Okay, let's talk a little bit about lymphatic vessels that are larger than capillaries. We'll go to the collecting vessels, lymphatic collecting vessels. These have walls similar to the walls of veins with just 3 layers, a tunica intima, a tunica media, and a tunica interna. And like veins, they have valves on the inside that prevent backflow. The difference is that the lymphatic vessels have walls that are much thinner, shown in this picture, than the walls of veins. Even though 3 layers are present in both, all the layers are thinner in a lymphatic vessel. And there's a lot more valves, and this shows you a valve right here. Veins have valves that prevent backflow, but so do lymphatic collecting vessels. Okay, larger than lymphatic vessels are the lymphatic collecting vessels are the lymphatic trunks. So lymphatic trunks are larger than lymphatic collecting vessels. And there are 9 major lymphatic trunks that drain the interstitial fluid from large regions of the body. So there are paired jugular trunks, paired subclavian trunks, paired bronchomediastinal trunks, paired lumbar, and then a single intestinal lymphatic trunk. All of these are eventually going to merge in a superior region where they drain into ducts. And there's 2 major lymphatic ducts. Notice that the 2 lumbar trunks, I know they're kind of hard to see, but they are labeled R lumbar and R intestinal, form this kind of triangle, I guess we'll say, or tip of a triangle, and then there's a sac in the center. That sac is called the cisterna chyli, and it also accepts fluid from the intestinal trunk. So as fluid moves from the legs, it's going to enter probably that lumbar trunk and go into the cisterna chyli, which will continue into the mediastinal trunk and eventually reach the subclavian vein. You aren't going to have to trace that, but I thought it might be helpful. And here's a picture that shows that region of the intestinal and lumbar trunks and the cisterna chyli in much larger detail. This is not a lymph node, even though it's an enlarged kind of thing. It's a sac-like structure where three trunks merge. And these three trunks are draining, a lot of the body. Everything inferior from the waistline, basically. Okay, let's look at the two lymphatic ducts up close and personal-like. The one on the right, conveniently enough, is called the right lymphatic duct. And the one on the left, I don't know why, but it's called the thoracic duct. Anyway, whatever. Both of those go directly into a vein, shown in blue, that is called a subclavian vein, because clavian refers to the clavicle, and these veins are just beneath the clavicle. So this is where the recovered interstitial fluid is finally returned to the bloodstream. Now let's look at, without tracing every single vessel, let's look at the end result of where lymphatic fluid comes from and which duct it enters. It turns out that all the interstitial fluid or lymphatic fluid from the right torso, thoracic region, the right arm and hand, the right neck, shoulder, and head, and back, of course, will enter the right lymphatic duct and therefore the right subclavian vein. The rest of the body, both legs, the entire pelvic region, much of the abdominal region, the left thoracic, left arm, left side of the head, all form fluid, lymph, that goes into that thoracic duct, which is on the left side. Now, I mentioned previously that lymphatic flow is one directional from interstitial fluid towards those ducts and the bloodstream, but the flow is quite slow and sporadic. Mechanisms exist to help make it move, and because of the presence of the valves, it's going to move in one direction. And these mechanisms that help the movement of lymph are like the mechanisms that help blood flow in the veins. So first, you've already been introduced to the concept of the skeletal muscle pump, and that is when you contract muscles in your legs and your arms, that presses up against veins to push blood. Well, the same is true with lymph. The skeletal muscles, when they contract, press up against the lymphatic collecting vessels and trunks, and therefore the lymph is going to move in the lymphatic vessel. Likewise, the thoracic pump, inhaling and exhaling, expanding and then decreasing your thoracic cage and alternately your abdomen because of the diaphragm action, will help move venous blood as well as lymph. But in addition, the lymphatic vessels that are larger, the trunks and not the collecting ducts, just the trunks, we'll say, they have more smooth muscle than the rest of the vessels, and they contract. This smooth muscle causes a rhythmic contraction. So that isn't normal with veins. Veins don't usually rhythmically contract unless told to do so by the autonomic nervous system. As opposed to lymphatic vessels, there's just a spontaneous contraction, kind of like the myogenic response. So if there's a stretch, there's kind of a recoil, so to speak. When lymphatic flow is impaired, maybe there's a tumor, or maybe vessels were broken and injured during surgery. Edema can happen in a very localized area. Now, this photograph shown on your right here shows a severe case of blocked lymphatic flow. The disorder is referred to as elephantiasis due to how severe edema got and caused the enlargement of part of the body. And this occurred due to lymphatic vessels being blocked by roundworms, parasites. They belong to the phylum Nematoda. And these roundworms are spread when an infected mosquito bites the skin and leaves either larvae or fertilized eggs in the interstitial tissues, but then those eggs or larvae get swept into the lymphatic vessel and the larvae mature, and all of a sudden the lymphatic vessel's blocked. And so you won't be able to drain the interstitial fluid anymore from that region of the body, and you'll get swelling or edema. Now recall that one of the secondary organs of the lymphatic system are the lymph nodes, and they occur in clusters near the body surface. There's hundreds of them embedded in connective tissue, but they're in specific regions like the neck, the cervical lymph nodes, or the armpit, the axillary lymph nodes, or in the inguinal region, the inguinal lymph nodes. And these clusters collect lymph that's going to be flowing in one direction back to the bloodstream. So let's look at in a little bit more detail why these lymph nodes exist. Why are these enlarged kind of organ or kidney-shaped structures? What do they do? What are they made up of? Well, they really are truly organs because they have multiple tissue types. There's a lot of white blood cells present in partitions like this, with some connective tissue in between these like triangles of leukocyte aggregates. And then there's blood vessels that also permeate these lymph nodes. The blue one, of course, would be a vein, and the red one would be an artery. So the lymphocytes and the leukocytes that exist inside the lymph node act to filter and cleanse the lymph as the lymph moves through the lymph node. This is the only organ or tissue that receives lymphatic flow and sends lymphatic flow away from it. So it's the only tissue or organ that has flow coming towards it and away from it. And so you see afferent lymphatic vessels bringing lymph into the lymph node, and then an efferent vessel that sends the lymph on within a lymphatic vessel. The advantages are not just, going through a filter, I guess. You actually need to slow the, the advantages of the anatomy are not just that the leukocytes are present, but another advantage of this anatomy is notice that there are many afferent vessels coming into the lymph node, but there's just this one efferent. Okay, this makes the fluid slow down. So with fewer efferent, which means to go away from, than afferent, the fluid will slow down, and this will give time for the leukocytes to detect any kind of foreign antigen or pathogen. And also, I should mention that in these lymph nodes, there are B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes that can be activated and can initiate a specific immune response, which is generally what happens when you get a vaccine or, unfortunately, are infected with a disease, which we don't want. Okay, now for the last topic of this lecture. This involves the importance of lymph nodes in the movement of leukocytes, white blood cells, between the bloodstream and the lymphatic system. We call this cycling of lymphoid cells, or leukocytes. As you know, leukocytes originate in the bone marrow through leukopoiesis and then leave the bone marrow in blood vessels. Notice here that the lymph node, of course, has capillaries supplying it. So we'll go with the arterial capillary, the red one. This is one way that leukocytes, white blood cells, can enter a lymph node. However, some leukocytes that escape through extravasation, escape the bloodstream and go out to the tissues to fight infection, might be picked up in a lymphatic capillary and brought to the lymph node. So you might have a leukocyte entering from this direction. But you could always have a leukocyte re-entering the bloodstream from a lymph node. So we know that leukocytes originate in blood, then they can enter the lymphatic system and they can go back to the blood here at the lymph nodes. I have a picture that might actually help you understand the different pathways that white blood cells can take from when they originate in the red bone marrow. So leukocytosis happens in the bone marrow, and the white blood cells, shown here as purple and yellow, enter the bloodstream. And we'll just assume they're both mature for now. And they travel in the bloodstream. Now, what if there's an infection? Like the skin, often you'll find specific leukocytes leave the blood vessels and go to the submucosa. So they enter the interstitial space. Well, now there's a lymphatic vessel that drains the interstitial space, and these leukocytes get caught up in it. And so the leukocytes are in the lymphatic vessel, and then they enter the lymph node. But as we know, there's a vein draining the lymph node of blood. Well, these leukocytes could then re-enter the bloodstream. So they start out in the bloodstream, and they can leave a lymph node from the bloodstream, and leave a lymph node and get back to the bloodstream. Okay, that's it for the first lecture on the lymphatic system, and there's one more following this one. Thank you very much for your attention.